Welcome to the fourth season of Murder in 20 podcast, where I, Bobby Stevens, am your host with a new episode every Wednesday. If you're a serious fan of true crime and love listening to podcasts, but don't want all that small talk, you've come to the right place. We get right to the facts. Murder in 20 episodes are concise and complete in 20 minutes. Less talk and more true crime. Be sure to like, share, and follow us to learn about upcoming episodes every Wednesday. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's get to this week's episode. Growing up, Scott McKay felt abandoned and resented women. For many years, he turned to alcohol and drugs to cope and began leading a double life. To his girlfriend and parents, he was a doting boyfriend and son. By day, he worked as a roofer, and by night, he was a predator. Average-looking, his dark hair neat and short, his nose bent to the right like he'd lost a fight, his lips thin and pressed tightly together, while his dark, soulless eyes hid the truth. The city was a sleepy little town back then, with a population of 250,000. Scott sought out vulnerable females working in the red light district of downtown Victoria and fed his insatiable appetite for sexual violence. In January 1986, at the age of 25, he picked up a 19-year-old lady of the night. But then he refused to pay for her services and prevented her from getting out of his car. Fearing for her life, she jumped out. Scott chased her with his car and tried to run her over. Luckily, she managed to escape. Scott was charged with unlawful confinement. He pled not guilty. With only a driving under the influence on his record, Scott was released on bail pending his trial. 11 months later, still out on bail, Scott picked up another lady, tied her arms behind her back, and sexually assaulted her. Scott was arrested and charged with sexual assault. When police questioned him, he admitted he was a bloody monster. Again, he pled not guilty. Scott was released on $2,500 bail, pending his trial. Saanich, a suburb of Victoria, was considered a rural area where children felt safe. 20-year-old Marguerite Telesford had left her parents in Montreal and moved to Saanich 5 years earlier to further her education. She was living with her guardians, Bill and Norma Cowell, and was in her second year of studies at the University of Victoria. Marguerite was stunning, with black hair and piercing dark eyes, a broad white smile, and an air of confidence. She had a kind and gentle soul and enjoyed making people laugh. Marguerite worked hard at her studies, a straight-A student, and never strayed from her routine. At 5'9", she was tall and thin and barely 110 pounds. Every second day, at the same time, she donned her running shoes for a short jog around the neighborhood. On the morning of Sunday, January 18, 1987, it was just before 7 a.m. when Marguerite left the house wearing her white runners. It was cold, so she donned a pair of gloves, earmuffs, toque, red sweatpants, and leg warmers, and a sweatshirt. Her route was to leave her home on Cedar Hill Road, run along Mount Douglas Cross Road, turn on Blenkinsop, then Cadborough Bay Road, and back home. A half-mile from her home, on Mount Douglas Cross Road, an area bordered by trees and dotted with the occasional driveway, she neared a secluded dip in the road. Scott was driving his blue pickup when he spotted her. Perhaps he recognized her from when they both briefly worked for a bus company a couple years earlier. Scott pulled over and tried to grab Marguerite, but she kept running. Scott jumped back into his truck and rammed his foot down on the gas pedal, launching the truck forward as he aimed it at Marguerite. The truck hit her at full force. The block of steel knocked her to the ground. The band on her earmuffs broke. Scott stopped, grabbed a pry bar and shotgun from his truck, walked around, and shot her. Then, panicking, he realized he needed to hide the evidence and loaded Marguerite's body into his truck. Not one vehicle drove by. Not one person saw what happened. Left laying on the road was a pry bar and a shotgun shell casing. The Times columnist reported that a newspaper carrier and his friend were delivering newspapers when they thought they heard a gunshot. Then the sound of tires screeching as a vehicle sped off. A nearby neighbor heard the gunshots too, but didn't think it was unusual, as often hunters shot at the deer. The hands on the clock ticked as another minute went by. It was now 11 a.m., and Marguerite's family knew something was seriously wrong. Marguerite should have been back hours ago. They called police. Police quickly recognized that this was out of character for the young student and immediately began a foot search, retracing her route. Within an hour, in a ditch on the side of Mount Douglas Cross Road, officers discovered the broken and bloody earmuffs, a shotgun shell and pry bar. An officer crouched down on his hands and knees and looked for clues. Among small patches of blood on the road, he discovered some black hairs. Police canvassed the area, going from door to door and talking to neighbors. The next day, 24 members from the Provincial Emergency Program joined the search, along with a police helicopter. 2 days after her disappearance, Saanich police told the media that the evidence at the scene indicated Marguerite was dead. An infrared camera was brought over from the mainland, hoping that it could help locate her body. 15 detectives and police personnel worked around the clock. A search party of 350 people waded through Mount Douglas Park, searching for her body. A police dog was brought in to search Beaver and Elk Lakes. For 3 days, police were stationed from 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. along Marguerite's jogging route and recorded license plate numbers. 4 days after Marguerite's abduction, an anonymous person who was distraught called Saanich police. It was 11:30 p.m. But before they could provide any information, they hung up. Then 4 minutes later, they called police again, sounding even more upset. But again, they hung up. Police publicly encouraged the caller to call them again, but they never did. Police interviewed over 1,000 residents, but no new clues came in. 4 weeks into the investigation, the 15-member team was reduced to 4 full-time investigators. They consulted the famed FBI Behavior Science Unit Virginia to develop a psychological profile of the murderer. Exactly 1 month later, Scott and another man picked up a woman and took her to a local beach and sexually assaulted her. Scott was arrested and charged with assault. Police seized Scott's truck from his residence in Colwood, where he lived with his girlfriend. Police wondered if he was linked to Marguerite's disappearance and looked for evidence that might connect him. But they found nothing, and his truck was returned. Then 10 days later, both the Saanich police and the Oak Bay police received an anonymous tip. Police seized Scott's truck again. Investigators examined the truck, and wedged in the undercarriage, they found one blue Pompom from Marguerite's toque, along with one black hair. Scott was sentenced to 2 months on the assault charge. This time, the judge did not release him, and he served his time. After his release, Scott was tried and convicted for the first 2 assaults. In October 1987, he received a sentence of 12 years and was incarcerated at Kent Penitentiary in Agassiz. A memorial service was held for Marguerite in March. The FBI had concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to develop a profile of her killer. Meanwhile, the lab had concluded its report on the Pompom found under Scott's truck, and it was sent to Saanich police. But unfortunately, detectives at the time did not link it to Marguerite. A year went by, and Marguerite has still not been found. In March 1988, police received a tip telling them they would find her body in a settling pond behind a poultry processing plant in Machosen, 12 miles from where she was abducted. The pond was searched, but Marguerite's body was not found. With no movement on Marguerite's case, Saanich police brought in 2 new detectives to look at the case with fresh eyes. And the detectives soon discovered the Pompom and the lab report. With that evidence, the case finally moved forward. Police needed to seize Scott's truck, but resources were slim, and they had to wait for an RCMP officer from the Vancouver Crime Lab who had the expertise they needed. The truck was parked in Colwood behind a 32-foot boat covered with a tarp, sitting next to a fence. For 2 agonizing months they waited. Then in April, they removed 5 panels of fencing and seized the truck. Police hadn't waited for a search warrant, feeling that even behind bars, Scott might arrange for his truck to vanish. 6 days later, Scott was charged with first-degree murder. Officers escorted him to Victoria, where he appeared in court and was remanded to Wilkinson Road Jail. While in jail, Scott was pretty chatty. The province newspaper detailed how he told a fellow prisoner that he couldn't tell him where the body was because there's something with the body that will tie me to it, and begged him to testify on his behalf. The hardened criminal, convicted of 10 armed robberies and almost 40 break-and-enters, refused. Scott told another prisoner, "I know I did it, but it's my life and you've got to help me." He tried to bribe the inmate with $2,500 in his truck if he would memorize a statement that he'd written and read it out in court. When the inmate didn't jump at the opportunity, Scott doubled his offer. But the inmate wasn't about to perjure himself for a few $1,000s and turned him down. Prisoners behind bars adopt a code of silence. But disgusted by Scott's actions, they broke that code and agreed to testify against him. In early January 1989, a young boy walking his dog discovers skeletal remains down a steep embankment 13 miles away in the Highland area of Langford. The remains were sent to the hospital for identification by the coroner. There was wide speculation that they may belong to Marguerite. A few days later, police confirmed it was not her. A week later, Scott went on trial. It had been 2 years and a day since Marguerite was murdered. Sitting in the jury box were 11 men and 1 woman. Over 100 people packed into the courtroom, many friends of Marguerite's. So many attended that they flowed out into the hallway, and for the first time, loudspeakers were installed in the hall. Scott sat quietly at the defense table, dressed in a suit with his hair short and perfectly combed. Without the jury present, Scott's lawyers tried to get the Pompom thrown out because police did not have a warrant. However, the judge agreed to allow it on the grounds that police had acted in good faith. A traffic analyst testified that the Pompom became wedged under the truck from being run over. A hair and fiber expert testified that the hair found amongst the blood on the road and the one in the Pompom were consistent with the hair samples taken from Marguerite's comb. 4 inmates that Scott had confided in testified against him. Scott took the witness stand in his own defense and denied killing Marguerite. When asked about the inmates' testimony, he claimed 2 of them approached him, asking where her body could be found, because they wanted to use it to bargain with authorities. And he denied saying there was something with her body that would link it to him. Rather, he said he was hoping there was something on the body that would connect the real killer to it. During his second day of testimony, he surprised the courtroom. The Vancouver Sun reported that he accused police of framing him for the murder and planting the Pompom under his truck. After a 2-week trial, closing arguments began. Scott's lawyer declared he was innocent and that his fellow inmates tried to frame him so they could reap the benefits of money and drugs. After 2 days of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict. Scott stared straight ahead and didn't flinch, appearing stunned when they announced guilty. Scott was sentenced to life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. Scott appealed his sentence. His conviction was reduced to second-degree murder and his sentence reduced to 15 years. However, the parole board denied him parole 5 times between 2004 and 2021. For many years, Scott denied his guilt, but eventually admitted that he killed Marguerite, but claimed he didn't remember doing it and didn't know where her body was. As of this writing, Scott is 62 and has served 37 years in prison. A psychological risk assessment determined that he presented an average risk for sexual and violent reoffending. On March 15, 2024, he was granted day parole. Scott's parole has many conditions. Thanks for listening to Murder in 20 with less talk and more true crime. Be sure to tune in next Wednesday for the episode of Mark Rogowski. By the age of 14, Mark the Gator went pro. But when street skating took over, his popularity skateboarding dove. Then, wanting to settle down, he knew Brandy was the one. But when he discovered she was seeing someone else, it broke his heart. And he sought revenge. If you're dying to hear more, past episodes of Murder in 20 are available for free at murderin20.com and on all major podcast platforms. We love what we do and are dying to continue. If you enjoy listening to Murder in 20 every week, we'd be eternally grateful for your support by visiting Murder in 20 at Patreon, PayPal, or murderin20.com. We'd like to acknowledge Purple Planet for use of their music, sound effects from Vaseline Studios and Quick Sounds, and our many editorial sources who are listed on our website. Be sure to like, share, and follow us to learn about upcoming episodes every Wednesday. Stay safe, sleep with the lights on, and don't play with strangers.